So welcome. You are in the right place if you wanted to attend a session on building civic capacity. That's the title of this workshop. And my name is Mary Lee. I will be your moderator for what is really going to be a very, very informative panel. You are blessed to have some tremendous activists, advocates, philanthropists sitting at the table here with me who really hark from across the country. So we've got Chicago and Baltimore and Los Angeles, and I think Jennifer is probably a woman of the nation right now. She's all over the place. And you're going to get perspectives on really what is a corollary to what we were just talking about if you were in the big session downstairs, because they were talking about putting this work into practice mostly from the standpoint of philanthropy. But we're going to talk about the civic capacity, the capacity of community-based organizations, folks in community, and what those connections really are about. And just by way of introduction, I'm going to give you the name and organizational title of each of the panelists, but recognize that their bios are all in the program, and I'd encourage you to read them because this really is the richness of their backgrounds that they're going to bring to the table this evening. So first, to my immediate right, Angela Hurlock, who's the Executive Director of the Claretian Associates. Am I saying that right?
That is correct.
And then Dixon Slingerland, who's the Executive Director of Youth Policy Institute here in Los Angeles. I should have said that Angela's from Chicago, Dixon here in Los Angeles, and he's going to talk a lot about some of the exciting things that are happening here in LA that connect to some federal initiatives. I should have said that Angela's work has been directing a faith-based organization in Chicago, which has had, again, a tremendous impact on revitalizing communities there. Then Scott Spencer, who's the Associate Director for Advocacy and Influence of the Annie Casey Foundation, and who has, in his work, made a tremendous impact in Baltimore, particularly with issues of economic development, and he has also a background in working on the Smart Growth Initiative. And finally, Jennifer Vanica, who is a partner of Vanica Cummings, and she is really someone who has had experience on the ground, both with philanthropy, with community engagement and community involvement, most notably in the San Diego community where the Market Creek Plaza was developed, and that's been just such an interesting journey to follow, to put so many ideas and concepts of vision into practice. Not all of these stories, I don't think any of these stories are going to be perfect. They're going to be interesting, and they're going to tell you what it really takes to see change on the ground, the bumps and the bruises, and also the wonderful accomplishments and achievements. So I'm going to turn it over as we begin to Angela.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. So as Mary mentioned, I am Angela Hurlock. I'm the Executive Director of Claretian Associates. We are a community development corporation in South Chicago, to be exact, which is a small neighborhood to as far southeast in Chicago as you can go before you hit the Indiana border. And the capacity that I'm talking in today, though, is our partnership with LISC, which is an intermediary, LISC Chicago, which is specifically an intermediary that works in Chicago. We are one of the new community programs New Community Program Network recipients. And so we've been working with LISC for the better part of about 15 years or so, 15, 17 years. And as part of this collaboration, the New Communities Program was initially started with a grant from MacArthur Foundation. And to be exact, MacArthur gave its largest North American grant to LISC to do the New Communities Program. It was $50 million over a series of over 10 years. And that allowed them to infuse resources into 17 lead agencies, which actually equated to about 28 communities out of the 77 communities that exist in Chicago. And then those lead agencies were able to work in a very grassroots level with other agencies directly in their communities to be able to create what's called a quality of life plan. And so it was kind of resources down and information and input up, kind of meeting in the middle. And so over that period of time, over the period of 15 years, there were 3 different rounds of 5-year periods in which different quality of life plans were done, implemented, and then kind of a start over. So it's comprehensive planning, and that's basically looking from the community part and partnering and leveraging resources at a lot of different levels. I think one of the things that when I was reading the monogram that really stuck out to me was just this whole concept of how do you make sure that when you're bringing in external partners, that as you're using residents and resident input, that you don't have residents threatened while you also are able to garner that kind of big best practices and kind of global outlook that you get from those external inputs. So it's kind of like, how do you bring all of that together at the same time? For us, Claretian Associates was actually started by an order of priests, the Claretian missionaries, and our mainstay has always been housing. So our footprint is about 5 by 7 blocks, not extremely large as far as a building footprint, and then we oversee about 2 or 3 different zip codes within the city. So what this partnership for us allowed us to do is not only work in housing, but work on the south side of housing and have the resources to be able to expand our work. And then I've been there 11 years, and in the time that we've been working with LISC, we've been able to expand our organization. When I first started there as executive director, we had about 5 part-time people and 5 full-time people. To date now, we have about 100 people that we worked with. We've expanded from just doing housing to also doing safety. If you're familiar with Ceasefire, which is a prevention and intervention program with youth 16 to 24, as well as the Safe Passages program, which is a partnership with Chicago Public Schools and the Culture of Calm to create a safe environment for our children to attend school. Through those 2 programs, we're able to hire 80 residents to provide safety and other kind of assets basically for our community. So they're not only helping the kids get to school safely, trying to give them other resources beyond being involved in gangs, but they're also, for us, identifying vacant properties that may be problematic, other issues that come up through the neighborhood and that we can actually address. So whether it's safety, whether it's financial literacy, whether it's a variety or a myriad of other types of issues that come up, we're able to work around those things beyond what we would be able to, our capacity would be able to, and we're able to bring residents in to be kind of that think tank, part of that think tank, to create the solutions to those issues.
I was really pleased to be on this panel because it took me back almost 20 years to a project, a Hope 6 project I was involved with in Southeast DC, where I worked with community residents over 2 years for them to develop their own plan for how to spend. It was about $3 million in social services dollars. So I just have been involved in and really enjoy the civic capacity piece of place-based work for most of my career. So then fast forward 10 years, we do work all across Los Angeles, but we decided around 2005 really to focus on a place-based strategy here in LA. So there's 3 communities that we are targeting. That's Pacoima out in the valley, Hollywood, East Hollywood, which is the Hollywood you think of, but there's very high poverty there, and then Pico Union, which is actually just north of here. And so when the Obama administration came in and also took a place-based focus to their poverty education work, it was a real natural fit for the work that we've been doing. And so we've been lucky to have been awarded all 3 of the White House neighborhood revitalization initiatives, which were, I know, referenced in the plenary. And Luke Tate from the White House, I'm sure we'll talk more about it tomorrow. But that's Promise Neighborhoods, which started with a planning grant in 2010, and then we got the $30 million implementation grant in 2012. Choice Neighborhoods, which is out of HUD and focused on the housing piece. We have a planning grant. Burn Criminal Justice, which is the public safety component, which just finished the planning, is now moving into implementation. And then all of that culminated this past January when I was honored to join our mayor at the White House when the president announced that LA had been awarded a Promise Zone. One of only 3 cities in the country now that has that designation. So I think what this administration has done a great job of, which we're trying to also model locally, is breaking down those silos between, in that case, federal agencies here at city, county, school district, to really be able to do this work better on the ground, use existing resources, braid funding streams. And what they did with all these grants, as I mentioned, is include a planning period so that we could really engage residents, nonprofits, community-based groups in developing the strategies around education, housing, economic development, public safety, which has been a vital part of that. The Promise Zone designation, which is the most recent thing, has already in this first year resulted in $53 million in new federal funding coming to LA, and specifically into the geography, the place-based geography of our Promise Zone. So we're really excited about the potential of what's going on, about the resources that are coming in. Just to give you a little sense of what some of that funding looks like, Gear Up funding, 2 Gear Up grants that we just got from Department of Ed, will take 5,300 6th and 7th graders and follow them for the next 7 years. 5,300 6th and 7th graders with all the supports we can provide to them over that 7-year period. To give you a sense of the scope of that, that's about the size of the entire 6th and 7th grade in places like Boston or San Antonio that we're going to be doing with these. It's about $29 million in Gear Up funding. So it's the potential of tapping into what the administration is trying to do and braiding their own competitive federal funds through things like the Promise Zone. Of course, this work has to be data-driven, and that's something that I think we probably all agree on. With our Promise Neighborhood work, we've got 10 outcomes, 23 indicators, and everything we do is about moving the needle on those outcomes and indicators. In our case, we're using efforts to outcomes as our data system, a data system that has to be shared. All of our partners put their data into it. The school districts putting student-level data into it. Getting the community involved in looking at that data and making decisions as we move forward for data-driven decision-making is a really important piece of the work. We've taken the approach in our place-based work of being both school-based and center-based, because we don't think there's any one silver bullet to doing this work, to fighting poverty. And so we partner with lots of schools. We've got 18 schools in our Promise neighborhood, 45 schools in our Promise zone, 5 schools we run ourselves, both charter and district schools that we operate directly through IPI. But then we have centers throughout the geography. And these are family source centers. These are LA terminology. Family source centers, youth source centers, and work source centers that are covering different populations and different types of services so that we can provide sort of a comprehensive cradle-to-career approach through the place-based work. I think what we have here in LA, and this didn't come up too much in the previous plenary, is phenomenal leadership locally in LA around this work. And I think it's one of the reasons we've been able to secure these signature federal initiatives is because of that leadership. Our mayor here, Eric Garcetti, has been a champion for this approach going back 5 years when he was city council president. He took at the time what were the city poverty dollars, which were spread like peanut butter across 15 council districts, and focused them in specific places of highest poverty, which is now the family source system. And so he's had that approach throughout his career as an elected official and now as mayor. We're really able to build on that work and do exciting stuff, including working with Doug Guthrie, who runs the Housing Authority and is slipping out the back.
He was hoping not.
I just said great things about you, Doug. You missed it. And then also, since Eric has come in as mayor last year, he's restructured the youth source system, which is youth employment dollars. He's just restructured the work source system, which is workforce employment for workforce services for adults. So there's a lot of exciting stuff going on in LA. We think that the place-based work around the Promise Zone, the Promise neighborhood, is tied directly into that. It's an exciting time in LA. And maybe I can talk a little bit as we get into the questions about some examples of how that's working on the ground. But thank you.
It's hard for me to actually stick to the notes that I had, but I'm going to try to do it anyway. But because there was just so much stuff that has come up in the course of the discussions today that are actually embedded in here. And so, and Bart probably talked about half of what I might talk about the East Baltimore work. But I'm going to really hit on, as a funder working in place-based areas, you know, I've been observing over the past couple of years what I want to highlight as sort of what I find as 3 sort of conflicting notions about this work. You know, you've heard this all through the day. The first one is really that our investments in this type of work have to both be urgent and they have to be patient. You know, as we start seeing what's going on in communities, you know, my observation is that over the past, you know, when I started doing my work in community development 30 years ago, Nobody wanted to live in cities. You would try to find ways to incent people to move into cities. Now cities and towns are the hot places to go. And so there's this urgency around, if we're really trying to do the work to preserve the neighborhoods for the people that have been living in the neighborhoods and have suffered through the tough times, there is an urgent notion to doing this work and doing this business right, which means that there's a level of investment that has to go along with that urgency. And we have some examples of that I could talk about in our work in East Baltimore. At the same time, though, because there are communities that have been left on the sides for a long time, we want them to have voice, they want to have voice, and that requires the opposite side of the urgency, which is the patience, to be able to enable them to be at the table, to be able to process what's going on, to be able to give voice to their concerns, their aspirations, their goals. And one of the things that we found that we've had to do over time really has been to invest in and really, in certain ways, buy the patience of our partners. And those partners being our civic partners, are some of our institutional partners who are driven by the market forces and the forces they see that are driving them to do what they want, that they're seeing the need to have happen in our neighborhoods in order to make them into more desirable places for everyone to live. So for us, we're sort of managing the crossroads of those two areas, which I think is a pretty interesting challenge for us as philanthropy to do in the first place. Secondly, is the sort of the idea that philanthropy, increasingly wants to have this rigorous focus on results. Results-based orientation, results-based accountability. Yet the work and the process of community engagement is not as tidy and neat and focused as a results focus. And in certain cases, those who want the results may not necessarily understand the fact that in order to get to the result, you actually have to sort of go through this untidy process. Bart made mention of the fact that as a part of the work in East Baltimore, there were 300 meetings. There really could have been about 60 meetings, but some of those meetings were repeated 5 times over because you had new people who were coming into the experience every time over, and so you had to sort of relive that process and that experience over and over and over again in order to really to have sort of this collective consciousness, this collective engagement, and sort of this collective I won't even say buy-in, but in our instance, it was understanding of what the process was and their role in that process. And so this tidiness of results-based focus and this rub of the untidy community process are just very conflicting standpoints from the role of philanthropy. And we say we want to invest in both, but sometimes we will retreat from investing in both sides of that. And then the third one I want to highlight is, in certain ways, is the one that part of it troubles me a lot because, we go to communities and there was this conversation today about we talk about how communities are assets, but most of the way we have set up the things in our systems are really you don't get money from the federal government by having a lot of assets. You get money from the federal government by demonstrating your liabilities, your deficits. If you're a poor person, you have to basically prove that you are poor in order to get money. You have to prove that you don't have something in order to get something, and that is it's a hard notion. So you tell a community that they have a whole series of assets, but in order for us to be attracted to you, you have to have a level of suffering that is going to attract us to you in the first place. And that's a conflicting notion. It's just simply a conflicting notion. So the other side of this is that in certain cases there is the need for communities in order to demonstrate that they are worthy of your investment for you to be able to punch above the weight that you have. That is that you have to demonstrate this set of assets. Even though you may not have them. You have to demonstrate your willingness to come to the table, even though you may not have the time. You have to demonstrate all these things that the investors say that they want to be able, they want to see in order to invest in you, because they want to improve they want to work with you to improve the circumstances in your place. And so I just wanted to lay out those three conflicting notions for you, because I can give you lots of examples, and we can have a lot of discussion about sort of how that plays out in the work that we've been doing.
I used to tell people that one of the big capacities I had to have to do this was to become bilingual. I needed to be able to move to one community meeting and know that when somebody used the word reggae, they meant Jamaican music. And when you moved to the next community meeting, reggae stood for Regulation A that governed the sale of securities, particularly the team working on the IPO. I had the great privilege of working with Joe Jacobs and his family foundation for 20 years. I was a baby. And Joe was chairman of the Jacobs Engineering Group, headquartered in Pasadena. The foundation was really very new at the time. So, I have to just have you picture this for a minute, because a lot of people think of San Diego as, the sunny southern part of California and haven't seen maybe parts of it. But it was right after the Rodney King riots. 1992, I'm standing at an intersection that was lovingly called the Four Corners of Death because of the homicide rate at that intersection. 42 gangs, 9 tagger teams, widespread blight from industrial dumps that had been abandoned, toxic water channels, 40% dropout rates in the high school, and the main economic driver was methamphetamine at the time. And there was absolutely no grocery store and no drugstore serving 88,000 people. Now, this was before things like food deserts were even coined as a term. And I would have died for PolicyLink to stand at my side back in 1992. So here I was, and what I was asked was, what would it really take? What does it really take to turn a situation like this around? And then I was asked to go figure it out. And, I don't think the irony was missed for me of being asked to be in a structure that is intrinsically about the have and have-nots, to come into a community and to try to learn from folks what should really occur. But I decided to do it for 3 reasons, although my instinct was to run. I decided to do it. And the first reason was because the person who asked me was Joe. And Joe was in the genre of philanthropists that Ralph Smith at Casey has coined as the wildcatters. I don't know if you've heard him speak on this, but he got it from conversations with Sam Gary in Colorado. You might know him from the Piton Foundation. But wildcatters in the oil industry are the ones that are willing to drill in places that are unproven and with absolutely no evidence that they're going to produce any results. And so they're the real risk takers. And they're the leverage whatever you have, and they're the all-in philanthropist. As Sam Gary would put it, there's no point in building half a hole when you're drilling for oil. So I was really excited about it too, because I was really being offered an open field, literally an open field, without anything predetermined to try in real time to figure it out. So it was literally a 20-year period of being able to understand it close up and personal, and to try to figure it out. And the third reason I had the courage to try it was because Joe agreed that if things didn't unfold very well, that he would enroll me in the witness protection program. And I knew actually then that he had my back, and that was certainly really important. But by serendipity, just a short story, Joe sent me to Cairo to work to train trainers in participatory strategic planning groups that were working in the Middle East and Northern Africa. And it changed the trajectory of our foundation. really seeing the international landscape. And I don't know if you've had the chance to see this TED Talk by Ernesto Ciroli. Have any of you seen this? So he was an international aid worker, an Italian who was working in Africa at the time. And he wanted to help the Zambian people deal with food shortages. And he's looking at this fertile river valley of Zambezi, and he says, oh, we can grow great Italian tomatoes and zucchinis, and he's very excited about it. And when they're ready to harvest the crop, the night before, 200 hippos come out of the river and eat the crop and trash the village. And what surprised him the most is that he was the only one surprised by the fact that this had happened, that people clearly expected that this was going to happen. And when he asked why didn't they tell him that, they responded, you never asked. Mm-hmm. And he he goes on to say he felt really, really bad about the mess the hippos left until he started realizing what the French and the Americans and the English were doing in Africa, and then suddenly felt really, really good that one of their outcomes had been to feed the hippos. So it's really a funny TED Talk if you get a chance to see it. But the title of it, which is the lesson of it, if you want to help people, shut up and listen. If you want to help people, shut up and listen. So one line that I got really fond of using over the years came from a community member in a meeting whose grandmother used to tell her, don't do about me without me. Don't do about me without me. And it spoke, I think, volumes about the legacy that we have of bad assumptions that we make about people in the name of helping. And this woman in particular was never going to usurp her right to be heard and to have a voice in the things that were going to impact her in life. So one of the big lessons for me over the last 20 years of changing place, whether you're working national, regional, local, wherever, with urban renewal as a backdrop for this, has been to shut up and listen, as Ciroli would put it, and to assure that there's a platform for the people being affected to have a voice first and foremost, and to become the central players of changing their own communities. So building civic capacity, to me, I think means how do we create these platforms for people and families to participate in civic life? And that suggests common purpose, relationships among people, connectedness, networks that can support people solving problems, and the ability to act. So when I was growing up, I always said the world was flat. You had a funder, you had a nonprofit, and you had a client, and these two rarely talked. And the universe is no longer that way. As funders, we thought our role was to set the agenda, select who was at the table, hold people accountable. We'd focus on a problem and go after the people who thought the way we thought in order to get that work done. We could maintain control and rely on experts. We could aim at detailed plans, empirical evidence, and highly efficient partners and well-structured programs designs. And I say today, that was absolutely great, so long as what we were doing was trying to teach Johnny how to read. The minute we had to shift over to get at the underlying issues that were impacting every child's chances of learning how to read, then all of those things became absolutely counterproductive in the process. So when I think of capacity and what people need to do this job, we need to assure that they have the ability to aim not at a problem, but rather at the need to move collectively towards a redefined future. If we are talking about inclusion, it starts with us and who we have at the table, the ability to work in teams, where all the people own the outcomes and the results, to build networks of extraordinary reach, to risk action with imperfect plans, and to rotate between planning and action as rapidly as you can, to learn at a high rate of speed, and to do that learning in real time. and to resist what the Rensselaerville Institute once coined as structural containment, that we begin to build more flexible, evolving structures as containers for action, because a lot of what holds us back are things of our own making, decisions and structures of our own making. To let go of the intuitive belief that efficient is faster, that faster is more effective, and realize what was rooted in the African proverb that says, to go fast, go alone, to go far, go together. And last but not least, when it comes to the communities we seek to serve, the capacity to shut up and listen. And with that, I'll shut up and listen.
I neglected when I began the panel, though, to tell you anything about me, and I wasn't really going to until Jennifer spoke, and I really feel that I need to add a little bit to the voices before you this afternoon. I am Deputy Director of an organization called PolicyLink, which is a national advocacy and action institute, and our focus is on advancing and ultimately achieving racial, economic, and social justice and equity, and we really take that seriously at PolicyLink, and one of our foremost tenets reflects what's going on in the conversation that we're having right now, which is that the wisdom and the voice and the experience of people who are living in the circumstances that we want to change have to be driving the change. They really are in the best place to articulate and design the solutions, and they need us as partners, and they need us, in our view, as links. That's why we have that name, to try and bring those changes into reality with knowledge and understanding of so many of the complexities in front of them and so much of the history that they've endured and often have overcome. And I also want to just give you a little slight note about myself, because prior to coming to PolicyLink, I'm an attorney by profession, and I was a legal services attorney here in Los Angeles for many, many years, and then became a consultant to nonprofit organizations working on community change and community development. And I was doing that work in 1992 when we had civil unrest here in the aftermath of the verdicts in the Rodney King abuse case. And it's so striking to me to be having this conversation now in the light of what's been happening all over the country with grand juries and their consideration of what's appropriate and what's not appropriate, and the death of so many young men of color, and how the more things change, the more they don't. And so, forgive me, panel, for going off script for just a moment, but I want to point out that in that context, right as I was leaving legal services and moving into becoming a private solo practitioner working with community-based organizations, we had the occasion to go and visit Market Creek Plaza in San Diego. The Jacobs Family Foundation had started this effort. And we were so struck with all of the parallels in those communities as well. And although we had a great opportunity to bring good ideas back, the other thing that was very compelling to me was the notion of working deeply in place and deeply in place for the long term, which in Los Angeles was manifested by a funder collaborative, the LA Urban Funders, which responded to the civil unrest by committing to shared investment over time in specific places, which was really my first experience with place-based philanthropy, but not with place-based community change. And so I will add to what the panelists have said, and that is the knowledge of working community should always take into account that folks were working on issues before you got there. And those issues have to also surface. One of the reasons for those 300 meetings, I'm sure, is a chance for people to talk about what they'd been trying to accomplish and some of the things that they had accomplished and what happens to those efforts as well. So with that in mind, I had a whole host of questions that I was going to pose to the panel. And I'm not going to go too far off script, except that you answered really what was the first one, which was what's the value of community participation. I don't think any of you need to go back over that, because I think you so eloquently all, in your own ways, addressed how important and how connected it was. And I just heard a few things from you that I want to underscore as you answer the question I'm going to pose to you in a minute. And I want to underscore that for the participants here, these values of community exchange, which teach us to be patient, which teach us to listen, which teach us to build upon the resources of the faith community, which I often think gets lost in this conversation about community change, the incredible anchor that the faith community has provided when no one else was there. The faith community was there, and sometimes with very little to add other than faith. And I just want to make sure we recognize and acknowledge in the affordable housing context, in the issue of access to food, in some of these issues about violence, it has been the role that the faith community has played that has helped us shape and build on that work for other initiatives. And then the issue of targeting community, which I think is something that Dixon was talking about, just understanding and having a place that you know and learn and come to understand very deeply from the very beginning of a youth's experience up through their work experience and beyond. So with all of that, and I won't talk about myself ever again in this session, I do want to ask some questions of the panel, particularly about the role that philanthropy plays in supporting the kind of community participation, engagement, leadership that you're talking about. Is that role shifting? Are funders more aware and more supportive, or are they asking for community engagement as a requirement, a value in their relationship with you? And maybe along with that, are they giving you funding or making funding available that helps develop the expertise that community residents need to be active participants in the initiatives that you're working on? And you guys can pretty much all answer this question. I have no particular defined order unless somebody wants to take a shot at it first. Anybody? You look at it.
Well, okay. I definitely think that funders are asking more for community input, and I think it's because one reason is because of sustainability. How can you sustain something if there's not buy-in at the level of the people that are receiving whatever resources you're bringing or whatever supports you're bringing? But I think it's not only just the financial supports that are being brought. Earlier there was a concept of, there was a question about the media and what part, during the lunch plenary, what part the media can play in the work that we do. And a lot of times when we're working in the communities, we forget to tell those stories. I know for our organization, or our neighborhood, if you were to Google South Chicago, the imagery that you'd find probably like 2-3 years ago would be things that tell you that we were considered the murder capital of Chicago, and the closing of the mills, and 100,000 people losing their jobs, and things like that. So it's really been the support that we've received from LIST to have scribes and learn how to tell our own story and create, put out there better images of what's actually going on in the community, and to teach those, because one part of it is not only about us being a lead agency, but us doing this together with other organizations and other residents that are doing different things in the neighborhood. We're all doing different things, adding to this kind of collaborative of improvement in the community. But how do you tell that story so that when someone does Google South Chicago, they get all these variety of positive imagery, and not just you know, what's going on as far as safety or disinvestment and those types of things. And so I think that's a creative partnership, not always dollars and cents, but it's also in resources. And that's utilizing the various levels, including the residents, which are a key asset.
We were funding this organization called Safe Middle East Action Committee. And we were the principal funder, and there's a danger in being the principal funder for the organization, that you could tip them. You know, so that they would flip into another IRS regulatory framework. And so we gave them money, but we certainly did not give them enough money. And because they were a community organizing group and they were fighting for the rights of the neighborhood, they were a vocal group. And what that did for other funders was it made them scurry away. And so their ability to actually build capacity through fundraising was sort of soured because they were doing what they were supposed to do, and so it made it a challenge in certain ways for them to be able to be effective advocates. And this is where I get to the part about how we sort of bought patience, and you know, and Bart talked about it pretty well. You know, our president chaired a housing and relocation committee, and because Casey was the larger investor in it, he was able to, he first of all, he showed up every other week and chaired the committee, which for a National Foundation president was a pretty major thing to do. And basically, you know, it was a committee of one. You know, he was pretty much the only person on the board who was there. And but every other week we would sit there for a couple of hours, you know, and listen to the community. And there were things that we had to do that may have taken, you know, a year or a year and a half, that in certain ways Casey had to invest in the patience of our partners in order for that community voice to be heard. And so to me, there was a great deal of value in having their voice there. There was a great challenge in their being able to present their voice in a way that other organizations would do it because of how they were viewed by the outside world. You know, walking down the streets organizing, you know, is seen as a negative thing by lots of people, and they may have been doing that, but that's what they needed to do in order to get the attention of power, of those people who were in greater power. And so what we were able to do in response was to be able to sort of hold the line on allowing them to have their voice and their time, which actually informed a lot of stuff about the project. You know, there were so many things that they helped inform, and that we got out of their participation in this work.
That's excellent.
You know, I just to jump in, I loved Doug, and one of the reasons he was an investor in our work as well, but Doug Nelson. But what I loved about him is that he would come to the community that we were working in and really engage in real conversation, and not just with us or the other, 14 funders that were part of the effort, but he would be in community meetings and in real human interaction. And so often there's so many layers between a real person on the ground and a foundation director or a board member of a foundation, that so much gets lost in the translation. It's very hard to make that up. And I have noticed, I've been concerned actually about this pendulum swinging the way it's swinging. You know, it seems like it goes back and forth and we don't kind of stay long enough or deep enough to really figure things out. But I'm a very big believer that we need the national and the regional work, and it needs to be connected and integrated at the local level. But what concerns me is the potential of residents being seen as valued players and central players that can so easily be lost in that paradigm. And so that is a concern to me. What's exciting for me about some of the more kind of local foundation work is the shift. You know, I know we have people from the Colorado Trust here today. There is a shift. I felt it with the conversations with your team, and I've had it with others, that not only are they asking their kind of traditional and the kind of grantee conversations, really moving towards valuing participation and civic participation, but they're actually beginning to use participatory techniques themselves. And I think this is a really, really important breakthrough for the field, to engage directly in community listening, directly in outreach teams that can inform the work and the theory, that can teach how to work across cultures. You see people using things like participatory evaluation and appreciative inquiry, and of course our work was really based fundamentally at the beginning around the technology of participation that the Institute for Cultural Affairs developed. And we felt it was important to practice that ourselves. So, we can't say we're going to build an inclusive society and then start debating whether to include people, whose lives we're trying to impact. And so I think this is a really, really important thing that's beginning to happen within the foundation world in terms of participation.
We've been lucky in LA that sort of coinciding with the Promise work around 2009, 2010, the Annenberg Foundation pulled together a group called LA in Sync, which is membership is mostly sort of all the major foundations in town, philanthropic groups. And the purpose of LA in Sync is to help LA, number one, sort of get its fair share of federal and national philanthropic dollars, but also to put LA at the forefront when it comes to signature federal initiatives. So we've really been joined at the hip with LA in Sync now for 4 or 5 years around this work, and I think it's been a fantastic partnership, at least in terms of the resources that we've generated from the feds. But the piece of it has been that they came in when we got these planning grants for multiple of these initiatives. LA in Sync led the effort to bring in matching dollars for the planning work. So unrestricted dollars that could be used for community engagement, could be used for convenings of partners, could be used to send promotoras door to door throughout our communities. And so that was vital because the planning dollars we got from the feds were not sufficient to do what we wanted to do in our geography. And so philanthropy took that on and allowed us to really have a fantastic planning process. The other part of it has been is really sort of the partner development piece. So we've got 32 community-based groups that we sub-grant funds to out of our Promise neighborhood. And so that's a lot of work around collaboration and getting folks to share data and getting partners to work together and aligning strategies. And so we can't do that work without the support of philanthropy, because that's some of the hardest and most rewarding work. And so I think in LA, it's been just great timing and a great partnership.
I'm just wondering if there are specific types of expertise that you think people need to have in order to be involved, and how do we find support resources to support them getting that? Anybody?
Go ahead.
Well, so on the first thing, I think, I like the shut up and listen part, because on one side, we need to learn how to shut up and listen. And there's hearing, there's listening. And one of the things that I really took away from the meetings was that, you're going into their neighborhood and you're telling people that they have to move. And so the process is anger, fright, anxiety, worry, all those things, and how that manifests itself in what their communication is may come out as a spewing of anger, and it'll come out in lots of ways, and we sit there and we'll there's a tendency to treat it like the adults in a Charlie Brown cartoon, and you just want to ignore everything because it's just like wah 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 wah. But if you sit there and you sort of strip away your ability to basically, this is not about you. This is really about them, and you strip away that so that what is coming at you is not about you, as the person who's working with them through the process, but it is about what they're feeling, and then you start hearing the kernels of what are coming out of their mouths and their voices. There is a whole lot of policy that actually can grow out of that, that we actually worked on and that developed out of sitting there and listening long enough to the community. So on one side, I would say that's the tool that we need to have, and I think that we need to be able to teach others in the professions about how to engage and how to deal with community. On the other side, it's sort of knocked me out. We did it one time. We were going through. There'd been one round of planning it was a charrette that one of our residents called the charade. So you had all these professionals who came in, and they laid out plans, and I mean, it felt like 8th grade math, because the professionals are sitting there like this, hovered over the and the community couldn't participate. So we went through a second round, and the residents actually there was a high-level consultant that was hired to do a second level of planning. There was a description of what was going to be going on. The second round of the redevelopment was going to do 2 types of housing development. There were blocks that were going to be preserved that had basically a higher level of occupied housing and quality housing, and there were those that were going to be demolished because there was a large level of vacancy. Well, the residents went out themselves, they took the maps, and they went out and they did their own survey and came back and basically laid it on top of what this $100,000 consultant was paid to do, and was the same map. So this is not college degree type of stuff. It is basically communicating to people what the shared goal or outcome is, and letting them go and bring back the information, their own reconnaissance of their own neighborhood. So I don't know whether there's any level of expertise, technical expertise. There may be some stuff around. The one thing that came up this morning, I think it was Bob who talked. Was it Bob who talked about community-driven, community-led, or community engagement? And I think there is a shared responsibility on what is going to be delivered. That's not expertise. That's a communication skill. And for me, so the community should not necessarily expect that because you're engaging them in the process that everything that they want is going to be done at the end of the day. And I think that's that's not an expertise. That's just a set of communication to me. So.
Can I jump in? I don't know. Okay, so I love this question because, and kind of the sad part, I think, is a lot of people ask a slightly different question a lot, and assuming that the lack of expertise in communities is actually a really good reason to exclude people or to limit their role, right, in the work. And, I think part of the expertise that I had to learn myself, which is kind of like being on a 12-step program, is suspending your own worldview long enough to, really listen and to keep yourself in a learning place and to assume that you don't know the answer to things and that you're really honestly willing to learn from everybody and the gifts that are at the table. If you flip the question about what expertise is needed, and as funders, we are always targeting the residents, but we rarely say what expertise do we need. And so it was neat that you actually did, I think, begin in that way, because if I had a show of hands just from this group, how many people have experience in health? Just put your hands up. How many in education? How many in urban planning? How many in securities law? Anybody? How many in the culture of East Asia? How many in the culture of Eastern Africa? How many can speak 8 languages? Anybody? Arts and culture. Probably some hands experiencing in arts and culture. Social enterprise, business development. Is there anybody in this room that can say they have experience in all of those things? Nobody. So, to go into a community context and assume that there's no expertise to do this work, is really thinking is asking the wrong question, really. They're just like all of us who maybe you've got securities law, or at least
I didn't raise my hand for securities law.
We can all take different roles, right? So everybody brings their gifts and talents to the table. It takes a lot of people to build a village and a lot of different types of expertise. So it's not that people don't need expertise to know that they need a grocery with fresh fruits and vegetables in their neighborhood. The kids need to be able to walk the streets and not be killed. You don't need a lot of expertise for that. But in this next period of the work, where we've gone is knowing that top-down doesn't work, knowing that bottom-up doesn't work, and that somehow we have to actually be able to be in real conversations as human beings, right, rather than roles, about what we're going to do together to build, an inclusive and equitable society. And that starts with each of us being comfortable in the room with difference, right? being really good at being in the room with people who don't think the way we think. So it's not that you don't need experts, but I think you run the risk of believing that if you have a degree, you're the expert, or if you have the money, you're the expert, and that's not necessarily the case. That, you know, if you didn't raise your hand, when I asked, do you have construction experience, I don't want you building my building. I just don't. So but we were able to find and get 74% of our construction contracts into the neighborhood. We needed to have a securities lawyer with us, but people in the neighborhood were able to plan an IPO, do the deal without broker dealers, translate the legal documents into simple enough language for their neighbors and their children to understand it. And 450 people invested, including from ages 8 all the way up to 92. So, you know, you obviously need architects and planners, but those plans are going to be a lot better if mothers who are walking their kids to school have an equal voice at the table in terms of how plans roll out.
So I equate that with kind of this, like, making sure that the residents have visions for themselves, because a lot of times when you live in the same thing every single day, you lose vision of an asset. And so I'll equate that with the Bible in the Old Testament, when the 12 kind of spies were sent out to kind of look at the promised land and see what was going on. 10 came back and said, oh my God, there's giants, we can't do this, this is crazy, we're gonna be stomped to death. 2 came back and said, oh, there's giants, but there's all this other great stuff, it's gonna be great, you know?
Yeah.
And it's like they saw the same thing. And in our neighborhood, it's actually through the partnership that we have with LIST that we started doing these neighborhood tours. And when we started having other people come into the neighborhood to look at our neighborhood, we had residents that said, why do you want to come here? There's nothing to look at here, right? But then there were residents that actually got on the bus and did the tour and said, oh, I see this every day, and I didn't really look at this as an asset. I didn't look at all the murals that we have and the artists that we have as an asset. I didn't look at, you know, all of these things that we have that are actually assets in the community. So I think one part of it is that the residents, everyone involved has to have some vision, and they have to see the assets on the different level from whatever viewpoint they're looking at. I think that's critical.
And just to augment that, I think sometimes it is being given a listener, somebody to listen so that you can take the time to have a vision. I think for so many people in low-income communities and communities of color, it's that never being aware that you can have a voice in policy change and what the development looks like. And other folks in affluent communities take that for granted. Of course they're going to ask me. Of course my needs and my lifestyle will be taken into account before they decide to put a toxic waste disposal dump, which they would never put in my neighborhood. But in a low-income community, you don't know that you could stop that and you know, have a say. Dixon, I didn't want to cut you off.
Yeah, no, I think just building on that, I mean, having a voice in something real, I think, is very important. So one thing we're very excited about in 2015 is we're going to be doing a participatory budgeting pilot led by the mayor's office, where the neighborhood councils in the Promise Zone will take $1 million and be budgeting those resources within the zone. So we go on the assumption the expertise is there. That's not even a question. But it's about making sure that that voice is actually changing things, and then that's a pilot that can be replicated citywide. So we're really excited about that.
Yeah, and that's that bridge capacity, I think, that so many times nonprofits and funders can be, is that bridge to the policymakers between community residents. And that's that knowing how to step back, knowing how to facilitate, but not necessarily doing it for people, doing it not outsiders coming in, but with. So
I really liked what Angela was saying, too. If you think about all the studies that have been done on human resiliency, right? We've already proven that people need relationships, they need a vision of their future, they need to feel that they have a gift or talent, and these are great platforms for that to happen. And everybody is capable of participating in public life, so I think we have to come at it from that perspective.
What are some of the nuts and bolts? Because I don't hear that talked about. It's kind of passed over. When you can't do what they want, or you're not willing to give up that power because you have that power as a funder to be able to decide yes or no. You may not even listen. As an evaluator, I've interviewed so many residents who say they think it's a lot of BS. They've been involved with a lot of people. They've been to more meetings, as you're saying. It's just another chance to make people feel good that they reached out to the community, okay? And they're not doing anything different. Now, you're all good people, and I know you're sincere here, but that's not the way the world works for them, especially with the governments and other sorts of funders. So what I'd like to see if you can get into the kind of, how do you deal with that conflict between what people want, to differentiate between you want to be informed and when people are really when people and residents are really driving and have the power, and how do you deal with that? I think that's really important advice to funders as somebody who looks at their work on a regular basis. How do you negotiate your intention to do what people want, but your limitations?
Yeah. What came to mind to me when you were talking about 5 years ago, we had a conversation around safety in our neighborhood, and we brought together lots of groups, the alderman's office and the police department, and lots of resident groups and other organizations. We didn't do anything around safety. We're a housing developer, like I said, but we knew we had to do something around safety. You can't rent an apartment or sell a home if you can't walk down the street. So we convened this group, we started talking, and we started bringing in different people. We had the Boys and Girls Club, we had the YMCA Street Intervention, we had Ceasefire, we had a variety of different people come in. There was no one everyone agreed on. There was infighting, there was, if you bring this particular group in, we're not gonna have anything to do with it, blah, 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 blah. You can't make everyone happy. You have to really work with a consensus and keep moving to what can be done. The end result, we ended up bringing in Ceasefire, the YMCA Street Intervention Team, and Safe Passages. So we brought in 3 different groups. I think that goes to show you about, the monogram was talking a little bit about neighborhood typology and understanding your neighborhood and what's gonna work for you. That is what worked for us in our neighborhood. That is what is working today for us in our neighborhood. It might not work tomorrow, but it's working for us today. And some of those same groups that said, we'll never work with them, we don't care, are right still at the table. Sometimes people will squawk, they will yell, they will scream, they will try to say, I'm taking my marbles and I'm gonna go home and forget you, but you just have to keep moving forward. Everyone is not going to be happy, but there's some middle ground that everyone can get to. That's just how I feel about the issue.
Yeah, I mean, our planning and community engagement has been around creating an implementation plan that can then be presented back to the feds to bring in implementation dollars. So it's so you can't include every idea when you're doing that because you need to submit a plan that makes sense and is competitive and has aligned strategies. However, if you look at the appendix to our Promised Neighborhood Implementation Application, which was a 500-page appendix full of programs and strategies around every conceivable piece of the cradle to career continuum, we included a heck of a lot of ideas that came out of the interaction with the community, going door to door in the community, surveying the community. So I think you just do the best you can given the reality of what you're trying to accomplish. In our case, it was to make sure that these significant federal resources came to LA. While having maximum engagement at the same time.
You know, if you really only want to hear input, it just needs to be really clear to people up front, and usually people are okay with that. It's when they come in with an expectation that they're really going to have a voice, and a lot of times as funders, I think historically we've funded organizations to learn how to put pressure on the decision makers and haven't really put them at all into decision-making roles or to, try to flip that power dynamic. So to me, it was all in the process that you actually can feel very comfortable letting go of controlling decisions if there's a really strong process. And for us, we had to define comprehensive a little bit differently, which wasn't doing everything, but it was doing what we did do in a comprehensive way that linked social, economic, physical, and political development, and defining consensus as kind of clustering towards issues of common concern and ownership of the planning and the action, so that people had to say, can they, not necessarily if they didn't agree with it, can they live with it? Because sometimes ideas did come up on the table that were highly offensive to people or art that was offensive to people. You want to know that, and you want to know it right up front. And we just agreed that, you know, if there were people who really were that strong about it, everything stopped until we were able to get a strong enough process developed again to make sure that people understood the issues, that everybody had a chance to weigh in. But we practiced two things. Well, yeah, what we call the technology of participation, right? You are moving towards that the issues of common concern and moving action. So we called it laddering. You know, instead of doing people hate community meetings. They hate them. And they hate committees because they go on forever. People feel like things don't get done, or we have another press conference over a murder and nothing happens. It's very discouraging. And when it comes to funder-community relations, you know, one guy called it always feels like we're a dog. You know, it's like the resources are like a rabbit in a dog race. They're always like, we keep coming to meetings and like nothing ever happens. And so laddering for me stood for listen, activate, design, do, evaluate, refine, and rotate again. And rotate as fast as you can, setting 90-day benchmarks so that action moved. People could come in and out of teams. It wasn't like a long-term commitment. You could see the end before you even started. The beginning, people knew they were going to move action, and it really worked. And they also knew we were going to circle back around to keep checkpointing what we were hearing, because a lot of times we were making assumptions about what we thought we heard until community residents interpreted that data and had it mean something very different.
I mean, I think in our instance, I mean, there were levels of this. I mean, there was obviously when the project was first announced, I think the residents felt very disempowered in certain ways. There was a point, you know, as the foundation came in, and I think when the original principles about housing and relocation were established, there was a sense that there was an ability to feel empowered by the residents, to actually that their voice actually mattered, and so with that there was a growing sense of power by the residents in being able to help design some of the things that went on. There was also a point in time when I think there was an abuse of power by the residents, and you know, there was we had a long process around demolition, and it was a you know, and it was an environmental justice concern. It was a rightful concern by the residents, and the leader of their organization actually went to an abuse of power of their authority and their power in the process, and it was a major public. It was a major public falling out in certain ways, and you get, especially you have power when you have the president of the foundation sitting at the table, and you know you're getting his. But it was limited also because there was a point in time when those residents didn't have a seat on the board of the organization, so there was a limitation of their own power. There was then a point where they actually had a seat on the board, but when they went over that edge, and in my estimation abused their power. By statements that in any other measure would be called offensive. There was a calling of it, and at the point where it was like we can figure this out, or we can stop the project now. And it reset a balance. I mean, it didn't because there was a point where their power came back. I mean, they came back with authority, with voice, with agency. But you know, there had to be a point where a line had to be drawn because I think it was not a good night.
Last exchange and the last question is a great illustration of how much more there is to talk about. I think, in a sense, we only really scratched the surface of the relationship between community and philanthropy. And to your point, I think civic engagement has to be at least 180 degrees, if not a 360-degree discussion and consideration. There is a whole nother level of power. As much as we can talk about power between the foundations and community, the power between the policymakers, and not just government policymakers, but commerce and corporate policymakers and media policymakers, all of these people having an impact on the lives of those who are in disadvantaged communities, and how do we create equilibrium, how do we create access and dialogue and power dynamics that are effective. And I think in some ways the exchanges that we're hearing about right now are, at least in my life experience, have shown that some of the most effective community activists locally who are now engaging with policymakers in the elected offices, engaging with corporate officials, learned that from their engagement with philanthropy. And the philanthropy that's shifted over time, changed over time in the last 10 or 12 years, again, in my experience, to be much more accessible to the people that they fund, not just to the nonprofits, but to the community residents. So as frustrating as those meetings are, and I tell you I've sat through my share, I now know many community residents who would never have had a chance to talk to a Bob Ross or to a Doug Nelson, and they've had that in their lifestyles. So they're giving me the wrap-up sign. And usually when I moderate a session, I love to end it by saying some nugget of wisdom from each of the panelists. But I started writing them down, and I can't go through them all. You guys were incredible. I mean, some of the things that you said here are going to stick with me for a very long time. This notion, again, of the urgency, but also the need to be patient. And you also talked about, Scott, about how messy this can be, and it doesn't fit neatly within the lines. And you know, I'm always struck by the things that Jennifer brings to the table, and so many of them today resonated with me a lot. Not just the shut up and listen, which I need to do right now, but also this whole attitude and demeanor that you bring to this work, and getting to know a little bit what Angela's talking about, of the parable that she talked about of seeing the same thing through different eyes. Is a very, very compelling way to look at this work and the way we do it, and then the tremendous breadth of the initiative that Dixon is operating, and the need to bring together this tremendous national asset to a community that is never going to fit neatly with anybody's description. I'm coming from Los Angeles, can tell you that doing a place-based initiative in 3 very distinct neighborhoods in and of itself, you should take your hat off to the man. So what I will do is encourage you all to visit the websites of these 4 incredible people. You'll find wonderful resources, more about them and more about their initiative. Just the Market Creek work alone. If you haven't had a chance, Google Market Creek, because she never really even told you the full story of how that is a microcosm of what it's like to try and harness power and create community change in a place-based, deep, long-term place-based engagement. Again, not perfect, but a really, really incredible and interesting effort. So I thank you all for staying with us through this evening, and we've got more conference to go yet tomorrow, so we'll see you all back here then. Thank you very much.